Hey, what's up, A-Bush kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Today, we're going to be covering topic 7.10, the New Deal. Our learning objective today is 7K. Explain how the Great Depression and the New Deal impacted American political, social, and economic life over time. Now, before we jump into our key ideas, let's go back and give ourselves just a little bit of historical context. Now, from 1929 to 1932, President Hoover was criticized for not doing more to end the Great Depression. Tens of thousands of businesses failed and unemployment rose to 25%. The American banking system during this time completely collapsed. Now, initially, Hoover relied on rugged individualism, but offered relief checks, job programs, but it was seen as really too little, too late at this particular time. By the election of 1932, when Hoover ran for re-election, Americans wanted hope and strong leadership. We can see in the campaign buttons, notice FDR on the left. It's for a new deal, for this new idea. Now, the Democratic candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, defeated Hoover and won the presidency in, well, a landslide, I think would be an apt term for this. Now, when Roosevelt was inaugurated as president, unemployment was at an all-time high, nearly 25% of all Americans. Now, do note, though, that that is an average across all Americans. Minorities and women had much higher rates of unemployment. About 1 out of every 3 African Americans at this time was unemployed. Now, in his inaugural address, FDR inspired hope, declaring, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Which then leads us to his presidency and our first 2 key ideas. First one, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal attempted to end the Great Depression by using government power to provide relief to the poor, stimulate recovery, and reform the American economy. And key idea number 2 says, during the 1930s, policymakers responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state, redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. So when FDR became president, he promised decisive government action to fight the Depression. Now, FDR believed the government should use what was called deficit spending. That's spending that causes debt to stimulate the economy. Now, much of this deficit spending is based upon the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist during this particular time. The basic idea behind this is that the government puts up the money initially and spends money on really just about any project imaginable. This puts money into people's pockets and gives them jobs. And with that money, they then can go and spend that money at local stores, which increases their revenues. The store hires more people, etc., etc. And you start to get an upward spiral. Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to create demand within the economy. Remember, one of the major causes of the Depression was that underconsumption. And by giving people money and jobs, now you're going to increase consumption and start to get yourself out of that particular cycle. The problem is, though, you run up massive debts in doing so. Now, in his first 100 days in office, FDR and Congress passed a broad platform of legislation to attack the Depression called the New Deal. The first action that he really takes as part of this New Deal was to address the banking crisis. Now, by 1933, 25,000 banks had failed across the country, and the U.S. was in a complete financial collapse. Now, most of this, as you remember from last time, was because of runs on different banks. Now, what FDR does is absolutely brilliant. He declares a 4-day bank holiday, and all banks were closed and inspected by federal regulators to determine if the banks were healthy. And what he published to the American people is that only healthy banks could reopen after the bank holiday. Now, what ended up happening was very few U.S. banks failed after the bank holiday. And during this inspection, most banks were deemed to be sound. But what this did, and most importantly, it gave people confidence in the banks. People now believed that the banks were actually solvent, had their money, were safe. And the government said, yes, they are safe, and kind of put a stamp of approval on these banks. And so this gave people confidence, and we stopped having the run on banks. We can see that progress that's made. You can see 1933, the spike to nearly 4,000 bank failures. And then after the bank holiday, it's absolutely nothing. Now, FDR was an immensely great communicator, one of the best presidential communicators we've had at all times. And FDR used the power of the newfound radio to communicate to the American people the steps the government was taking to address the problems of the Depression. In particular, he used what was called his fireside chats that used simple and clear language to explain the New Deal programs. It was a weekly radio address, and it gave people confidence that the government was actively fighting the Great Depression. It was called a fireside chat because it was in many ways like he was sitting down with you in your living room talking to you. The way that he worded things was that he was communicating directly to the people. Not only did Roosevelt help to ease people's confidence or ease people's fears of the Great Depression and instill confidence, but his wife as well did similar things with American confidence. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt served as FDR's legs and eyes as she toured the nation. And she became the conscience, really, of the New Deal as she expressed concern for the needs of American people. Now, she was the first lady to give lectures, radio broadcasts, write newspaper columns, and speak out on the behalf especially of African Americans during this time period. And I cannot express to you how important that was. Now, FDR, and it's not really kind of on here, it's just kind of hard to express fully here, but what she does is she redefines the role of the First Lady. Today, First Ladies have a cause, all right? Whether it was healthy eating with Michelle Obama to the Be Best program under Mrs. Trump, we see that all of this really leads back to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who championed the causes of those people that were less fortunate, especially African Americans. And she'll do so even after her presidency, or after FDR's presidency. When the United Nations is formed in the 1950s, she'll be the person that writes the Declaration of Human Rights from the UN. And she even serves on the board of the NAACP as the only white board member during the late 50s and into the early 60s. So back to the New Deal, though. The New Deal generally focused on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform, which we mentioned in key idea number 1. Now, most New Deal programs fall into one of these 3 areas. Now, relief programs were generally things like relief checks and job programs to help people that were either unemployment or they wanted to lower unemployment. But relief generally is help right now. Now, recovery were items that tried to stimulate the economy, stimulate agriculture, industry, trying to basically more kind of long-term goals, things that aren't going to help right now, but maybe help a broad sector of the economy. So relief is more individual people, recovery is more economy as a whole based or sectors of the economy. And reform tried to correct problems of the economy and prevent future depressions, especially related to the financial sector and the banking sector is where those programs were mostly located in. Now, easily the greatest success in the New Deal was its ability to offer relief to unemployed citizens with unemployment checks and job programs. Now, during the New Deal, the government provided relief checks to 15% of all Americans. You can see that a lot of it was located in the southeast portion of the United States. A few programs to mention in particular included the Civilian Conservation Corps, otherwise known as the CCC. Now, it was a work program for young men, mostly aged 18 to 25 years old. They built roads, parks, soil erosion projects. They employed nearly 3 million men across the country, doing all different types of work. In fact, many of the fire roads that we have in the backcountry in the United States were created by the CCC. Another government program that was created at the time to help eliminate unemployment was the Public Works Administration, the PWA. They hired more than 2 million Americans to build airports, dams, schools, hospitals, and parks. They funded construction of more than 34,000 projects. even built aircraft carriers, and 70% of the new schools and one-third of the hospitals built at the time were built by the PWA. Now, the New Deal also wanted to create long-term reforms to address weaknesses in the American economy and address the causes of the Great Depression. For instance, they created the Security and Exchange Commission. This was going to regulate the stock market to help prevent another crash. And we can see that they did a pretty good job of this. Notice we've got the stock market crash here, but then for the most part, the markets have just continued to go up since then. In addition to this, and another area of reform was in the banking sector, and this was the creation of the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This tried to guarantee consumer bank accounts and restore public confidence in banks. To this day, the government will insure up to $250,000 of your money in each bank account to this day. The number of banks that failed these days are incredibly small, and we are generally not worried about banks failing. If you go to your local bank today, you'll notice signs all over the place saying FDIC insured. We can see the number of bank failures goes down dramatically, really from the 1940s all the way to the present, with a few spikes during some areas of instability in the 1980s and most recently. In addition to this, attempting to other reforms and attempting to stimulate the economy was the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. This tried to bring electricity to the South and create jobs for thousands of people. The TVA built hydroelectric power plants in 7 southern states, providing and issuing cheap electric power to a region where most people, when the sun went down, that was the lights going off. In addition to this, the TVA not only provided the cheap electricity, but not on the screen, but important for you to understand, is that it also provided for flood and erosion control in this region, which helped to stabilize the farming and agricultural industries in this particular region. That should be on the PowerPoint. It's not, but make sure you add it into your notes. Now, the New Deal programs also tried to recover the economy and stimulate industry and farming. For instance, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, was created to help farmers and stimulate agriculture. Now, the way it did this is that the AAA paid farmers not to produce crops, and the government hoped to increase crop prices by reducing supply. Generally speaking, it worked, and it helped farmers. However, they never made enough money to truly stimulate the economy. In addition to this, the government created what was called the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, and to stimulate industry in the country. Now, what the NRA did was it set fair wages and hours for workers and minimum prices for products. However, the NRA failed to create fair competition, stimulate industry, or end the Great Depression. By 1935, FDR began an aggressive series of laws called the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal was passed by Congress in rapid succession, known as the Second 100 Days. Other programs during this Second New Deal included the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. And this created jobs for as many as 10 million men, women, and youths in a variety of building projects, such as the ones that you see pictured on the bottom and on the right. Now, the WPA not only provided construction jobs and building projects, but it also gave money to a variety of professions, including artists, musicians, the theater, other art projects. I mean, really just tons and tons of free stuff. Now, even education. Now, writers and teachers got money from this as well. And children, community centers. Now, the WPA was wide-ranging at this time. And even gave money to doctors as well. Now, another major part of the Second New Deal was to combat poverty among the elderly and disabled. The Social Security Act was created. Social Security provided an old age pension for Americans that were over the age of 65. Now, Social Security was also America's first welfare program because it provided payments for blind, handicapped, and needy children. This directly goes back to our key idea number 2, and this is kind of redefining the goals of modern American liberalism. This idea in modern American liberalism that the government's role is to help the people that are in need. Now, one of the other kind of big ideas with the Social Security Act was not just to provide for people that were over the age of 65, but it was also to get them out of the workforce. If you gave them enough money to retire, they could retire, and this would open up a job for somebody else that was younger at this particular time. In addition, this was good for businesses as well, because generally speaking, people that are older are more expensive to hire. They usually cost money. You've got to give them raises throughout their lifetime than someone who's younger that's just starting off. And this was a good idea for businesses as well. Now, one of the most important reforms of the Second New Deal was the Wagner Act. Now, this law protected workers' rights to strike as well as to collectively bargain. It also created a Fair Labor Practices Commission. The goal of this commission was to regulate unfair practices used by companies to discourage union membership. As a direct result of the Wagner Act, union membership in the United States is going to increase dramatically, as you can see from the chart. Leading us now to key idea number 3. Radical, union, and populist movements pushed Roosevelt towards more extensive efforts to change the American economic system, while conservatives in Congress and the Supreme Court sought to limit the New Deal's scope. Now, generally speaking, FDR was radical, and his radicalism led to criticisms of the New Deal. The most vocal critic of the New Deal was Louisiana Senator Huey Long. Huey Long's idea was called Share the Wealth, and his plan proposed taxing all personal income over $1 million and giving each U.S. family $2,500 per year. Now remember that $2,500 from our last lecture was the minimum amount that people needed to survive on a yearly basis, essentially the poverty line. Known as the Kingfish, he gave speeches across the country, essentially describing the income inequality in America to like a giant barbecue where the rich are going to eat 9/10 of the food. And how people like Morgan and Rockefeller and Mellon need to do with all that food. Well, give it all back, he said. Put that stuff back here on that table. Well, Huey Long threatened to run as a third-party candidate. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1935. And as a result, in 1936, FDR was overwhelmingly elected to a second term. However, like we've learned, second terms rarely go as well as first terms for president, and his second term will become much more difficult than his first. By 1937, President Roosevelt faced criticism that the New Deal was too expensive, didn't eliminate unemployment, and didn't end the Great Depression. Many people saw this as a system of the New Deal pump where simply all we're doing is just pumping money and it's really not going anywhere or not really doing anything. Now, FDR started to back off government-funded job programs, but as a result, unemployment quickly rose by 1938. The New Deal was not stimulating the economy to end the Great Depression. In addition to this, 2 New Deal recovery programs, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And the reason is that they fixed prices for not only industrial products, but also agricultural products as well. FDR feared that the Supreme Court would weaken the New Deal. So FDR threatened to pack the Supreme Court and increase the number of justices from 9 to 15. Now, many people were incredibly concerned by this, and they were outraged that FDR appeared to be overstepping his constitutional power and specifically upsetting the system of checks and balances. And in particular, by giving it to 15, we have to understand that with the checks and balance system, the person who nominates people to be on the Supreme Court is the president. So if you go from 9 to 15 judges, he gets to put those 6 new people on the court. And if you're looking at this cartoon, notice the 6 faces up here, the 6 additional members of this Supreme Court. look exactly like FDR right here. And what this means is that basically he'll have a bunch of yes men on the court, like we see in this particular cartoon right here, qualifying test for the Supreme Court. Yes, 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 yes. And so this will make him essentially kind of a dictator and let him take control of the Supreme Court, all right, by having all of these people on it that are able to just kind of do his own bidding. Now, after 1938, Congress is going to focus on trying to control spending and didn't pass any more New Deal laws. Now, however, FDR's New Deal dramatically changed the United States. The New Deal was successful in offering relief programs like the CCC, PWA, WPA to help people through the Depression. And in addition, the New Deal was successful in offering reforms to the stock market, banking, unions, and the elderly at this particular time. Leading us then to key idea number 4. Although the New Deal did not end the Depression, it left a legacy of reforms and regulatory agencies and fostered a long-term political realignment in which many ethnic groups, African Americans, and working class communities identified with the Democratic Party. Now, even though the New Deal did not lead to the recovery of the American economy, by 1938, 10 million people were still unemployed, and wealth still remained unevenly divided. Now, FDR's charisma and active involvement in the economy changed the role of the presidency as well as the expectation of the government. FDR's leadership unified African Americans, unions, immigrants, poor voters, all under the Democratic Party. Many of them had been Republican voters up to this particular point. Now, not all African Americans are going to just jump right over to the Democratic Party. It's going to take them about 20 years and several other Democratic presidents, including Truman, from 1945 to 1952, and especially Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson from 1960 to 1968 to really complete that transformation. Now, for the first time, the government is going to use deficit spending and create welfare programs to help groups in need. And this is really kind of redefining that idea of American liberalism, this idea that it's the government's job to help people that are in need. The problem, though, is that the national debt starts to soar really from this point. You can see it just goes up and up and up and up and up and up. So, anyways, in conclusion today, we've talked about the causes and effects of the New Deal, the problems that it's faced, the solutions they've tried to have, and the continuing effects. So that's all we have for our fairly long lecture for today. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button. And until next time, and always, go Pack.